The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the city park, where the world seemed to slow down, its constant hum quieted by the soft breeze. On one of the benches, an elderly man sat alone, his frail hands resting on his lap, his eyes gazing into the distance as though they were looking at memories long forgotten. He wore a gray coat that seemed too big for his thin frame, his face lined with the weight of years that had passed him by. He didn't speak to anyone. He didn't need to. The park, to him, was his refuge, even if it meant spending each day in solitude. A few feet away, a teenager named Ethan wandered aimlessly, earbuds tucked in, lost in his own world. He often came to the park after school to clear his mind, but today, something felt different. A sense of curiosity tugged at him, as if fate was guiding him toward the old man. He found himself walking toward the bench and, without much thought, sat down beside him. There was an awkward silence between them at first. Ethan wondered if the old man would speak, but he never imagined the words that would soon escape his lips, words that would change his life forever. Ethan had always been a typical teenager, focused on school, friends, and the usual teenage struggles. He wasn't particularly special, nor did he have any grand aspirations. He lived in the city with his single mother, who worked 2 jobs to keep the household afloat. Ethan, though aware of his mother's struggles, often felt like he didn't know how to help her. He tried his best to stay out of trouble, but the weight of growing up in a world that often seemed too big for him weighed heavily on his shoulders. He was an observer by nature, quietly watching others, always too shy to speak up. He wasn't the kind of person who made connections easily, and he often found comfort in his isolation. But something about the park and the man sitting on the bench that day felt different. There was an unspoken connection that made him sit down beside the old man, even though he had never spoken to him before. Ethan had seen the man around the park for weeks, maybe longer, but had never really thought about his life. It wasn't until that moment, sitting beside him, that Ethan began to wonder who he was and why he sat alone every single day. The man's name was Albert. He had once been a husband, a father, and a proud worker, living a life full of purpose. But now, all those roles seemed distant, faded like the lines on his face. Albert had lost everything over the years: his family, his job, and eventually his will to live. His days consisted of waiting for something he wasn't sure would ever come: companionship, purpose, or even just a simple conversation. Ethan, though unsure what to say, felt an overwhelming sense of empathy for the old man. There was something tragic in the way Albert sat there, a man who seemed to have been forgotten by the world. Ethan didn't know it yet, but in that moment, the loneliness of the old man would stir something deep inside him, a need to connect, to understand. "Excuse me," Ethan said quietly, breaking the silence. The words felt foreign on his tongue, but something about the old man's stillness drew him in. Albert turned his head slowly, his tired eyes meeting Ethan's. A slight smile tugged at the corners of Albert's lips, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Hello, young man," Albert replied in a voice that was warm but laced with an undertone of weariness. "I don't usually get many visitors around here." Ethan shifted uncomfortably, but was relieved that Albert hadn't turned him away. "I've seen you here before," Ethan continued. "Do you come here often?" Albert chuckled softly, his voice like gravel. "Every day. It's all I have left now." There was something in his words that struck Ethan deeply. He wasn't sure why, but there was a sadness in Albert's voice that seemed to echo within him. "I'm sorry," Ethan said before he could stop himself. "That must be hard." Albert's smile faded, and his gaze drifted away, as if he was once again lost in a sea of memories. "Life has a funny way of taking everything, doesn't it?" he mused. "One day, you have it all: family, friends, work, purpose, and the next it's all gone, like sand slipping through your fingers." Ethan could feel the weight of Albert's words. He didn't know how to respond, but he didn't want to leave. There was a part of him that knew he had to hear more. He didn't realize it at the time, but in that moment, a decision had been made for both of them. Ethan wasn't just sitting next to Albert for company. Something inside him felt compelled to stay, to understand the man's story. "What happened?" Ethan asked, his voice gentle but full of curiosity. Albert turned his gaze back toward Ethan, his eyes suddenly full of life, as if he hadn't been asked such a question in years. The old man took a deep breath, his hands resting on the bench as though they had once held the weight of an entire lifetime. Albert took a moment before he began to speak. "It wasn't always like this," he said, his voice trembling slightly as the memories resurfaced. "I had a family, 3 kids, a wife named Ruth. We lived in a small house just outside the city. I was a carpenter by trade, built homes, fixed things. I was proud of what I did." Ethan sat forward, listening intently. "What happened?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. Albert's eyes grew distant, as if he was no longer sitting on a park bench, but instead reliving a chapter of his life he hadn't spoken about in years. "It all changed one day. My wife got sick. We thought it was just a cold at first, but it was cancer. Stage 4. She was gone within months." Albert's voice cracked as he said the words, the pain of those years evident even after so much time had passed. "I didn't know how to cope with it," Albert continued, his hands wringing together. "I buried myself in my work, but it wasn't enough. My kids, they couldn't understand. They were young, they didn't know how to handle their grief. And I couldn't fix what was broken." Albert's eyes glistened with the memory of those years. "I tried to be strong for them, tried to keep everything together. But as time went on, I lost my job. I couldn't keep up with the bills. And one by one, they all left. The house was sold. The kids moved away. Ruth's death, my failures. It all felt like a spiral that I couldn't stop." Ethan sat quietly, the weight of Albert's words pressing against his chest. He had never known loss like that, at least not in such a way. But as Albert spoke, Ethan began to see a side of life that was both painful and real. The emptiness Albert felt, the sorrow of losing everything. It was something Ethan had never truly understood until now. "But," Albert's voice softened, "I'm not here to ask for pity. I'm here because I've learned something along the way." He looked at Ethan, his eyes filled with a mix of regret and wisdom. "Life, even in its darkest moments, has a way of teaching us something. The people we love, the things we've lost, they all shape who we become. And I'm not proud of everything, but I've learned that it's never too late to change, to find something worth living for again." Ethan's heart swelled with a mixture of admiration and grief. The old man was no longer just a stranger on a bench. He was someone who had lived a full life, who had lost it all, but had somehow found the strength to continue. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting the park in a golden light, Albert paused. His story had come to a close, but the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of understanding. Ethan felt a profound connection to this man, whose life had been full of joy and heartbreak, loss and survival. Albert turned to Ethan with a small smile, his tired eyes sparkling with something like hope. "I've spent so many years sitting here, waiting for someone to come by to listen. Maybe that's all we need sometimes, to be heard." Ethan swallowed hard, emotions rising in his chest. He hadn't expected to hear a life story like this, much less to feel like a part of it. But there was a new fire inside him, a realization that even in the face of despair, there was always a chance for growth, for change, for healing. "You're not alone," Ethan said quietly, the words coming from somewhere deep within. "You may feel like it, but you're not." Albert smiled, his face softening. "Maybe I'm not, son. Maybe I'm not." As the last light of day faded, Ethan knew that he wouldn't forget this moment. He had been a stranger to Albert, but somehow they had found each other in the silence. In the weeks that followed, Ethan made it a point to visit Albert regularly. He brought him coffee, sat with him, and listened. It became their routine, and slowly, the old man began to open up more, sharing even the smallest moments of joy that had once seemed insignificant to him. It was as if Albert had rediscovered his own voice. Ethan found that his own life had changed too. He began to appreciate the small things: his family, his friends, his future. He realized that no matter what difficulties he faced, he could always choose to find meaning, to create connections, and to move forward. Albert had taught him that. And as for Albert, he no longer sat in silence waiting. His days were filled with purpose once more. Not because his life had magically fixed itself, but because he had learned the true power of sharing, of connecting, and of never giving up. If this story moved you, like, share, and comment below. Have you ever met someone whose story changed your perspective on life? Let us know how this story has impacted you. And don't forget to subscribe for more powerful, heartwarming stories. Life is a series of moments, and sometimes all it takes is a simple conversation to change everything. So, who will you reach out to today? Stay inspired, and remember, kindness and understanding can make all the difference.